I'm very delighted to present our two speakers tonight because I think we have two very independent and distinct thinkers who are going to bring a very fresh perspective to this topic of faith. Andrew Cohen is a spiritual teacher. In fact, he's my spiritual teacher. He's been teaching for 25 years now. He's the founder of a global movement, an organization called Enlightenment, which is dedicated to the evolution of consciousness and culture. He's also the founder of the award-winning spiritual magazine of the same name, Enlightenment. And his original teaching of evolutionary enlightenment is really bringing forward the relevance of spiritual awakening for the 21st century, with a particular emphasis on how that awakening can impact culture. Now, he's the author of many books, but I'm very privileged to be holding in my hand tonight an advanced copy of his new book, Evolutionary Enlightenment. This isn't going to be released until September, and this is the synthesis of 25 years of Andrew's work, and it's had some remarkable endorsements from some very significant people, including Howard Bloom. Deepak Chopra writes, "Andrew Cohen made me believe that there has never been a better time to be enlightened." Now, I know I'm tantalizing you with this because you can't buy it tonight, but you can go home and order your copy online tonight. And failing that, Andrew's other very valuable publications on this topic are available, and he'll be here to meet you and sign copies after the talk. And here to dialogue with Andrew tonight is his friend and colleague, Howard Bloom. Howard has had an extraordinary range to his career, starting out as a scientist and then going on to become one of the most sought-after publicists to some of the biggest rock and pop names of the 70s and 80s. He boosted the careers of people such as Michael Jackson, Prince, Simon and Garfunkel, just to name a few, and that literally is just a few. He then went on to take his understanding of mass mind and mass media further, going on to become one of the most progressive thinkers, social scientists, and authors on the subject of human evolution and group behavior, writing critically acclaimed books such as The Global Brain, The Lucifer Principle as well, and his newest one, The Genius of the Beast. Howard will be here afterwards to meet with you and sign copies. There is one little quote about Howard I wanted to just read. It was a review for Global Brain. It said, "Howard is a modern-day prophet. Bloom compels us to admit that evolution is a team sport." I think that also sums up why I'm particularly excited about this combination of Howard and Andrew, because they are both deep and passionate thinkers who've really dedicated their lives to understanding the nature of who we are, the nature of cultural evolution, human evolution, and how we can take the next steps to create the future. So to have a conversation about the nature of faith in that context is, I'm sure, going to be very interesting and probably more importantly, very relevant. Will you please welcome Andrew Cohen and Howard Bloom.
You may wonder why Andrew and I have been brought together on the same stage. And it's because Andrew has just completed a book, Evolutionary Enlightenment. Yes.
That's it.
That's it. Okay. It's Evolutionary Enlightenment. And I have a book that's about a year old called The Genius of the Beast. And in reality, these two books are companion pieces. They fit like this. And what they both say is that we are stars to come alive, that's Joni Mitchell's line, that we are children of the Big Bang, that we are piles of protons, that those protons are 13.73 billion years old, that those protons have been through every crash, bash, and astonishment that this universe has ever produced. They've been in the hearts of stars as those hearts were born and kindled and crushed stars to make their light. And they've been in the hearts of those stars as those stars died. In fact, that's how they attained the qualities that allowed them to become us. That's how they became things like carbon and oxygen, as opposed to just hydrogen and helium. So, but the difference between us and the other piles of protons in this universe, the difference between us and the floorboards of the stage or the walls or the stones that drift as planets around distant stars, the difference between us and them is that we are piles of protons with a conscience. We are piles of protons with imagination. We are piles of protons with a vision. We exist at a tiny little thing called the present. And the present is this flitting boundary between the past, which is absolute and fixed, and the future, which has seemingly infinite possibilities. And we are positioned at the boundary of possibility space, to use Stuart Kauffman's phrase. And our job is to explore that possibility space. Now, instead of giving a stump speech, we're supposed to be having a dialogue. And frankly, we've been looking forward to this dialogue for something like 12 years. Andrew, I was stuck in a bed out in Brooklyn, New York for 15 years with a very serious illness. For 5 years, I was too weak to speak. And when I finally regained at least my voice, but not the ability to get out of my bedroom beyond my bathroom, my furthest destination, Andrew brought his entire staff from Fox Hollow, Massachusetts, down to my apartment, my very grubby apartment, my monumentally messy apartment in Park Slope. And that is how our relationship began. But Andrew sat in the background and let his staff do all of the speaking. And I've been looking forward to dialoguing with Andrew for a long time. So Andrew, what does progress have to do with faith?
Well, progress has everything to do with faith because, as we know, and we briefly were speaking about that before we came out here tonight, that there are many people today, very many highly educated people, that aren't really so sure that we're making progress. And I think this issue of coming to a very clear understanding or decision about the fact of whether there is such a thing as progress, number one, and number two, whether we as human beings are making progress, I think is essential, is an essential prerequisite for a human being, especially now, as we're getting into the second decade of the 21st century.
Well, let me jump in on that, because to give a few indications of the fact that you're right, and we are unequivocally making progress. In 1850, the average lifespan of a Western human being was 38.5 years. By 2000, it was 78.5 years. In other words, whatever we've done, all of those things that we have done that have allegedly poisoned the atmosphere, defied and destroyed nature, desecrated everything that's holy upon the face of the earth, and created every kind of toxic poison you can imagine. Well, apparently, all those toxic poisons and all of that desecration was good for us, because...
Well, I think that what you're bringing up is very important. I think it's good kind of to go through this slowly because modernism, which you've written about quite a lot about, because a very big point that Howard makes in a lot of his work and his writing is that modernism and capitalism has provided an enormous great leap forward at the level of culture and human health and possibility, and it's there's a lot of thinking in progressive postmodernism that the fundamental problem with where we are at the level of culture, that modernism and the great leap forward of modernism created all the problems, and there's a mistaken assumption in many people, I believe, that we need to go back to the good old days, but which is actually it's a fallacy. The things with all the problems that we're facing now of overpopulation and environmental degradation, et cetera, and climate change and all the rest of it. Still, the life conditions for more human beings on this planet in terms of the level of education, the standard of living, the freedom of thought, the freedom of movement, the freedom of possibility, the endless opportunities we have is literally historically unprecedented. I often tell people of my generation, I say, we are among the luckiest people that have ever been born in the history of human civilization. And I think this is important. It's an important truth to recognize, because if it's true that we're among the luckiest people that have ever been born in the history of our own species, if it's true, and I believe
it's true, it's
if it is
absolutely
true,
true,
then we should feel lucky. In other words, but I think that the irony or the tragedy of a lot of this, so much of this progress, is that so many of us, so many of the luckiest people that have ever been born, feel victimized and existentially lost, and that's why awakening to the significance of progress and of this evolutionary context, awakening to the context of cosmic evolution, biological evolution, cultural evolution, is actually so important, because then we're going to be able to see all our personal predicament and also the cultural predicament, and also many of the predicaments that we're facing, many of these global challenges that we're facing, all within the context of a cosmic process that's moving very quickly, that is progressing. Now,
let me break in on you for a second.
Please.
Once upon a time, our ancestors had asked the question, why are we here? And how did things come to be? How did they come into existence?
Yeah.
And they answered it with narratives of their own. And as we discussed backstage, by 1650, I mean, we know that what those narratives were in the day of let there be light. God created the whole thing. And by 1650, they had decided, the Christians in the Western world had decided, that God created a perfect world. So it must have been a sphere, because that's the perfect form. Why in the world would the globe be blistered with these great gashes and wounds of mountains and valleys and ravines? There was only one answer, because man had sinned. And God had been deteriorating this universe ever since. Everything had been going downhill. Well, we have the advantage when it comes to faith of two narratives.
That's right.
That they didn't have. One is the narrative of the history of the universe from the Big Bang to the protons in your hand that keep your finger from going through. Those protons are 13.73 billion years old. The other is the narrative that Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, gave us in 1795, and it was the evolutionary narrative. It was the tale of life progressing from the tiniest of starts to the most astonishing of things, with even more astonishing things, with this just being the prelude, and far, far more astonishing things coming in the future if we take our obligations to nature seriously.
If we take our obligations to nature seriously. And I think that, as integral theory has taught us, all great leaps forward bring their own new problems. And modernism, of course, gave rise to capitalism and democracy and the human freedoms now that many of us take for granted. And of course, it's also created its own set of enormous problems. And some of these problems are indeed threatening our existence. And that's also true. But that doesn't mean that progress isn't occurring. And of course, there's enormous challenges that we're facing. But I think it's helpful to realize that we're not going to be able to solve these problems unless we're capable of evolving the level of consciousness.
Well, there's something very important, and it's an implicit argument in your work, and it's certainly in my work, and that is those who look up go up, those who look down go down. And we have been so successfully propagandized since approximately 1960 by eco-theorists who make very good points, but forget something. Our problems are our greatest opportunities. Our problems are goads. Our problems are motivators. Our problems are things in which we perceive something in a way that bothers the hell out of us. And because we are bothered, that bother is our driver. That bother is the driver that gets us to transcend, to go to the point where people of the next generation will take for granted the solutions that we work out. Absolutely take for granted the solutions that we work out. So our problems are gifts in most cases, if they don't do what nuclear weapons do, which is threaten our very existence as human beings.
Well, but it's very interesting to make the maybe controversial point that ever since nuclear weapons emerged onto the scene, that there haven't been any more world wars.
Well, another point is the good old days. You brought up the question of the good old days. Well, if we went back to the good old days, we'd have 2 world wars in which sometimes 200,000 people on just one side were killed in a day of battle.
Yeah.
If we had the good old days, kids would be crippled with polio. If we had the good old days, we'd be dying at approximately 58 years old on the average, instead of close to 80 today, and beyond 80 in some cultures that do their health care and their diet and lifestyle better than we do.
There's another, I think, important fact to put on the table when we're speaking about progress and the significance of progress, which is emergence. And emergence originally was a term that came out of biology, But emergence is the recognition that greater complexity emerges out of lesser complexity. And that is, to me, the most extraordinary truth that I've discovered in the last 10 years.
Well, emergence, I've just been doing a history of emergence for my next book. Yeah, the next book is, well, I'll give you the original title, The God Problem, The Five Heresies, or The Big Bang Tango, Quarking in the Social Cosmos, Notes for the Post-Newtonian Science. And in that book, I trace the history of emergence. And it's very relevant to this conversation because it starts with two guys around 1850 who noticed something in chemistry. They weren't chemists, but they noticed something that chemists were discovering. And that is, if you put hydrogen together with oxygen, what is hydrogen? It's a gas. What is oxygen? It's a gas. Now, if we're logical human beings, we know that if you add one gas to another gas, what do you get? A gas. Gas in, gas out, stupid, right? And that's not the way it worked. When you put hydrogen together with oxygen, these two gases, and add a flame, whammo, you get an explosion, but coming out of that explosion, you get this stuff with characteristics which if we had never seen it before, if we had existed in the universe, let's say 6 billion years ago, when this stuff had never, ever congealed, if you described it to me, or you described it to me, I would have said you were wacko. Because it has substance, but you can put your fingers through it. It has substance, but it has no shape. What do you mean it has no shape? Well, it can soak into your carpet. Soak into your carpet? There's no such thing as soaking into your carpet. We've never seen this kind of stuff before, so to us, it's absolutely improbable. In other words, the liquid called water would have seemed ridiculous to us if we had gone around describing it 6 billion years ago when no liquid water had ever been seen. And it was that phenomenon that these two guys were looking at. Now, here's the big trick for us. This is a universe of supersized surprises. And supersized surprises are surprises of emergence, where something you could not possibly have predicted comes true. Well, we are emergence walking the planet on a daily basis. And our obligation, look, the cosmos is going to produce her next great surprises, surprises as big as liquid water, with us or without us. But it would be a hell of a lot more fun if it was not only with us, but if we were riding the curve and driving it as if it were a horse.
But also, looking at this whole notion of emergence, when we recognize, as we've been saying, this miracle in nature that, it's true in the cosmos and also at the level of biology, that greater complexity emerges from lesser complexity. No one's been able to explain how that happens. And of course, that's when, for those of us who are spiritually oriented, that's when the spiritual dimension of this all comes in. But I think once we recognize that emergence is an inherent part of this creative experiment that's happening in the universe, and all the more clearly and obviously at the level of life, then we also realize it's also happening as it relates to our interiors, our individual interiors and our shared interiors. So that emergence at the level of consciousness and at the level of culture is what I'm particularly interested in. And I think in terms of faith, having the faith and the conviction that enormous vertical, because often people develop, but they develop on a horizontal plane. That's self-improvement is you're kind of moving around the furniture. If the room is messy, you clean it up, and then we come in the room. If it was messy, you clean it up, it looks a lot better. So that's a big improvement. So that would be a improvement on a horizontal plane. But the development that happens on a vertical axis means you're going up to a completely different story in the building. You're in a completely different place. And if we're speaking about emergence, it's a place, it's a dimension, it's a possibility that never existed before that suddenly came into existence or emerged because you created the conditions that made that possible.
And it gets us back to the principle in a book called Everything Bad is Good for You by Stephen Johnson. And that is, why do people who, remember, I was in the entertainment industry for 18 years working with Prince and Michael Jackson and Bob Marley and Bette Midler and AC/DC and Aerosmith and Kiss and Queen and Billy Joel and Billy Idol and Paul Simon and people like that. What in the world do we in entertainment contribute? And do you have to contribute when you write a book? You have to keep people on the edge of their seat. You have to keep people involved. What are we doing? We are testing the edges of the culture that, and by now, the cultural inventions that have become boring to us. Well, hey, these were amazing cultural inventions just 15 years ago, or 50 years ago. And people's wives said, you can't write that. Nobody's ever going to buy that about elements of the culture we take for granted today. But we've become bored. And boredom has the same potential in it that problems do. It drives us to something interesting and new. So in the entertainment business, or when you're writing a book, we have to keep you entertained by going to the edge of everything you take for granted or are bored with and finding novelty that you are not bored with yet. So what are we doing for you as part of a cultural engine? We're turning you into a cultural engine. We are turning you into a perceptual engine. We are turning you into a perceptual engine that is constantly looking for its boundaries and then going beyond them, and then getting bored with what it finds beyond the boundaries and adding those things and moving on to something else new. Now, Clay Shirky's phrase, a cognitive surplus, hints that there is an existence to this larger cultural engine of which we're a part. And we are part of a search engine. And we are part of a search engine of the cosmos. And this is where progress comes in, because we are the cosmos searching for possibilities. We are the cosmos searching for impossibilities. We are the cosmos reinventing herself. And if you look at the history of the cosmos, what you'll see through emergent properties is a cosmos that is constantly reinventing herself. A cosmos that says, I want the creatures who will say to me, because those who will do it will transcend me. And in the process of transcending me, they will extend me. And that is our job.
Right, and the big shift that needs to be taken here is a reasonable, a sophisticated person will, if one walks them through these steps and historical examples, scientific examples, biological examples, would realize, oh, this is true, this is true, this is true. But then in terms of this issue of faith, especially now, you know, as we enter into, as I said, the second decade of the 21st century, the recognition that that evolution is a process that's going somewhere, and as we're in a shared agreement that the evolutionary process is the history of progress, that we're part of a process that is progressing, and if we realize that's true, and then we begin to contemplate the nature of consciousness, which is our own interiority and our shared interiority, and then begin to entertain the conviction that emergence can happen at the level of our own interiors, like a vertical leap. That would mean within our own individual interiors and ultimately shared interiors, level of our shared culture, it's possible for possibilities at the level of consciousness could enter into our individual subjective world space, and also within ultimately our shared intersubjective cultural, intersubjective world space, a new potential that never existed before.
Well, let me throw another little story.
Okay,
go ahead.
Just 1 sec. So the issue here has to do with faith, and it's very important. This is something that I really try and convey to people to share, which is that emergence is the nature of the evolving cosmos at the level of the cosmos, the level of biology, the level of culture, and also the level of consciousness. And we realize that's true when we allow ourselves to have faith in the possibility that emergence at the level of consciousness and culture can happen in and through us. We awaken to the inspiration and the conviction, for example, that Howard was speaking about. We realize, oh, it's really possible. And I think that that realizing, I mean, the evidence for it, at least I think as far as we're concerned, is inherent in many, is inherent in, cosmological evolution, biological evolution, cultural evolution. But when we think about cosmological evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution, we still see it as being out there when we realize all of that is happening in here. And we realize that emergence can also happen in here, in and as and through ourselves. Then we discover an enormous source of faith and conviction in what's possible.
Well, I wanted to add to that this little story. Back in the 1950s, psychologists believed that our goal in life, how are we doing with time?
Good, we have 7 more minutes.
We have 7 more minutes, okay.
Fill the question.
But at that point, psychologists, who are very much a part of this movement that sees the cosmos as random and meaningless,
right.
Assumed that all creatures want homeostasis. What does homeostasis mean? It means you want to be fucked enough that you no longer are interested in sex. You want to eat enough that you're no longer interested in food, and then you want to go to sleep. That's what they thought the goal was of all life. And they tried an experiment back in the 1950s. They put chimpanzees in a box, and a dark box, no windows. But it had one slit carved in the side, and it had a shutter on the slit. And when the chimpanzees were put in there, the shutter was closed. Now, and there was a little handle so that you could open the shutter if you wanted to. Now, they made sure that the chimpanzee had had as much sex as it could possibly be interested in, that it had as much food as it could possibly be interested in, and as a consequence, theory said, all it would want to do is sleep, right? It should be a happy chimp. That's what we want, is stasis, sitting in place. It didn't turn out that way. The chimps were utterly fascinated by that slide. And all they wanted to do was look out of the box and see what in the world was going on. So we are not creatures who are built for faith as a static thing. It is time to discard the idea that faith is a verb. Faith is a noun. And faith is not a noun, it's a verb. It's an action. It's a constant action. It's a constant self-reinvention. If you stop reinventing yourself, you're dead. One of the reasons that we are living much longer than we used to, and one of the reasons, I'm 68 years old as of a few weeks ago, one of the reasons you can be 68 years old and feel 40 these days is because you can stay plugged in and you can keep reinventing yourself. And I was telling Andrew backstage the story. I put Buzz Aldrin together with the 11th president of India, Dr. APJ Kalam, in February, and we're working on harvesting solar power in space, which is an endless supply, and will remove a lot of our energy problems. Well, I have a negotiating partner in India. He's 74 years old, and on Skype, we tend to get online when it's the beginning of his morning, it's 6:30 in the morning, his wife is preparing breakfast, and one day, we were online together, and he said, I've got a problem, my sister has just arrived. His sister, who is his older sister. He's about 74 years old, she's about 76 or 78. His older sister had just flown in from God knows what city in India to God knows what city my negotiating partner is in, because you don't have to know these things these days. All you have to do is have your laptop or your cell phone. And he said, my sister, when she got in the next day, he said, my sister, when she got in, sat down with her cell phone and made more phone calls in 2 hours than I've made in 2 months. What does that tell you? The thing that keeps us alive, when we feel we're unnecessary, we're like cells in the body. When cells in the body are unnecessary, they kill themselves off. It's called apoptosis. They have a built-in suicide program. So do we. But if you feel plugged in, if you feel that people need you, if you are connected to a lot of people, you have the life force, period. That is it. That Luke is the force. And this woman at 78 was functioning like a woman of 48 because she had the force. How in the world did she get the force? Through something that didn't exist 20 years ago or 30 years ago. This. And we listen to people who tell us that we are producing so many toxic pollutants, we are killing all life off. This is life. Over to you, Andrew. It's all yours.
Well, what I think is what I think makes the recognition, and the acceptance, because the shared agreement that Howard and I have about progress is not a culturally shared agreement. There are a lot of people out there that are convinced that things are getting worse, not better, as we were saying earlier. But I think what becomes very spiritually relevant as we awaken to the fact that we're part of a process that's going somewhere, and the process is making progress. And now, when we realize that the process awakens to itself and becomes aware of itself through us, that we are the eyes and the ears and the heart and the mind of the entire cosmos awakening to itself as us, that this human form, that this human body and this human mind and this human personality that's been conditioned by all of our biological history and our cultural history and our personal history is ultimately a vehicle for the evolution of the process. When we realize that who we are as Howard was saying, and this is something that's a very big part of what I teach, that who we are is the entire evolutionary process awakening to itself. And this is the human body, mind, and personality is ultimately a vehicle for that kind of recognition. When that begins to happen, when we begin to experience those kind of insights, those moments of transcendence, when we realize who we really are and what's actually happening here, then what we begin to awaken to is a moral obligation. Because then the moral obligation is, well, if in fact I'm the leading edge of a cosmic developmental process that started 14 billion years ago, and I realize that I'm part of this is a cosmic, biological, cultural experiment that's desperately in need of conscious direction, because now, because of our high degree of cultural evolution, this process now can be consciously directed in ways that it never could before. So, because we are learning so much more about who we are and how we are and what this process is. And so the issue then comes, well, I'm only going to have a certain amount of time to be here, and even considering life extension and all the rest of it, the question is, well, what am I actually doing with the life that I've been given, with the life that I have? Because if I am the leading edge of the Big Bang, does the life I live, the way I live it, the choices I make, the actions I take, do my moral convictions, my philosophical convictions, and my spiritual convictions, is my life become a living expression, an example of that, or am I still hypnotized by shared cultural beliefs and ideas that aren't awake to these bigger and much more relevant ideas? Am I living in a kind of culturally unconscious, hypnotized state? And I think the issue is too many of us are living in a dream, and it's a shared unconsciousness from the perspective of what's possible in the future. In other words, there's like the shared agreement of postmodernity was a state of enlightenment, relatively speaking, of awakening from traditional values and modern values. But now as we're progressing, we have to take the next step. And what I'm very interested in is the step beyond the postmodern one. What are our new shared values going to be as part of the postmodern shared agreement? And as I often say, sophisticated, sensitive people are aware of the fact that most of the shared cultural agreements that held society together, that really told us what the human experience is supposed to look like, how why we're supposed to be doing what we're doing. These shared agreements are falling away, and most of us have no idea what we're supposed to be doing. Earlier in human history, most human beings for most of history have been struggling to survive. Now, we are lucky enough, in spite of the recession, that we're able to be concerned with a lot more than survival. And the issue is, what are we doing with the modernity made the great leap, made education possible, women's liberation, emancipation of slaves, and all the rest of it. But now so many of us find that we don't really know what to do with our wealth, with our good fortune, with our education. There's an existential, almost paralysis. And the thing is, there is no such thing as free time, because with all the time as we're living, we're always making choices. It's what the traditional idea of karma. The choices you make are going to create future choices, which are going to create future choices. So the issue is, if many of the things that Howard and I were saying are true, and that we're part of a process that's going somewhere, and now as this process is awakening to itself through us, it's not happening out there, it's happening in here, and where we're all going is depending upon us. Then the next step has to do with us really being willing to take responsibility for what that means. And I think that the kind of spiritual transformation for an individual at the leading edge of cultural evolution has to do with really being willing to boldly consider, what that might really mean. And to be totally honest, I think for the luckiest people that have ever been born, to be too overly concerned with merely how it is that we're going to survive, just to make sure we have enough to survive, it's almost morally unjustifiable.
It's throwing away our lives. Yeah. I think the bottom line, because we're 3 minutes over,
and that is going
to basically sum up in coda what you were saying. Find your passions. Find the things you've wanted to do more than anything in life that you think are the defining things of you. Find your adventures, do them. Start to do them today, because if you don't do them, you will be stealing something from humanity. And that's in essence what Andrew is saying.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Howard.